Hey everyone, welcome. Today we are diving into a really short but super profound exchange between Jesus and his disciples back in Matthew chapter 19. It's one of those moments that kind of pulls back the curtain and shows you just how radical his teachings were, and it opens up this whole fascinating conversation about marriage, devotion, and what it means to have a divine calling.
Okay, so let's jump right in at verse 10. Jesus has just finished teaching about marriage, and his disciples hear this, and their immediate reaction is basically, whoa, if that's the deal, maybe it's better to just not get married at all. I mean, that is a pretty shocking conclusion, right? They're saying, if those are the rules, maybe we should just opt out entirely. This statement right here really sets the stage for everything that follows.
So that's the big question, isn't it? Why would they have such an extreme reaction? What could Jesus have possibly said that would make marriage, an institution so central to their culture, suddenly seem like a bad idea? Well, to really get it, we have to understand the world that they were living in. Check this out. At the time, Jesus basically walked right into a huge cultural debate about divorce. You had two major schools of thought. The House of Shammai was super strict about it, but the House of Hillel, which was way more popular, was extremely liberal. They taught that a man could divorce his wife for pretty much anything, literally for burning his dinner. So for the disciples, this easy divorce culture was just normal life. So when Jesus shows up, he doesn't just side with the strict school. Nope. He completely elevates the conversation. He takes it all the way back to the very beginning, to creation, to what God intended in the first place. He teaches that marriage is this sacred one flesh bond that people just shouldn't break, period, with the single exception of infidelity. Now, can you imagine? Compared to their culture where you could get a divorce for any old reason, this standard was so high, so permanent, it made them rethink the entire idea of getting married in the first place.
So how in the world does Jesus respond to their shock? He hears their concern, but instead of watering down his teaching on marriage, he clarifies that there is another path, but it's a very specific one.
And here in verse 11, Jesus immediately qualifies what he's about to say. He totally acknowledges that, yeah, living a life without getting married might be an option for some people, but he's crystal clear. This saying, this path of being single, isn't a blanket command for everybody. It's a special calling, a gift, and it's only given to certain people. And to explain this special calling, Jesus uses this really powerful analogy that everyone listening would have instantly understood. He breaks down 3 different ways a person might live a life of singleness. Okay, so to get this analogy, we have to understand the word eunuch. Back then, a eunuch was literally a man who was physically incapable of having children. But Jesus takes this very physical term and he uses it as a metaphor to describe 3 totally different situations, spiritual ones, circumstantial ones, where a man might live a life of celibacy. So here are the 3 categories he lays out. First, he says some people are just born that way due to natural circumstances. Second, some are made that way by other people, like servants or officials in a royal court who weren't allowed to have a family. But it's this third category that's the whole reason for his teaching. The people who voluntarily choose this path for the kingdom of heaven's sake, deciding to dedicate their entire lives to serving God. And this idea of a consecrated, single life that's totally dedicated to God, this wasn't just some random one-off comment from Jesus. The Apostle Paul actually wrote about it too. Yeah, the Apostle Paul totally echoes this idea. He talks about his own singleness as a proper gift of God that lets him focus on the things that belong to the Lord without as many worldly distractions. He sees it as this really powerful way to help build God's kingdom. But just like Jesus, he's quick to point out that it's a gift, a specific calling, not some rule that everyone has to follow. Okay, so we've got these 2 honorable paths in this life, faithful marriage and consecrated singleness. But how does all this fit into the bigger, eternal picture? Well, let's explore how one particular theological perspective connects these mortal callings to our eternal destiny. Now, this is a really crucial distinction within some traditions. For example, some sources teach that while celibacy can be a totally sacred and devoted path here in mortality, the absolute fullness of eternal joy and blessings actually comes through what's called the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. So in this view, one is a temporary mortal calling for God's purposes, while the other is seen as a requirement for the highest degree of glory. So let's bring this all together. What are the big takeaways from these few verses? Well, first and foremost, the ultimate goal is total devotion to God. That's the #1 principle. And second, you can live out that devotion either through a faithful marriage or through a consecrated single life. Both paths are honorable. What really matters isn't a person's marital status, but the purpose and the purity of a heart that is completely dedicated to serving God.
And this is exactly how Jesus ends the conversation in verse 12. He doesn't make it a command. He makes it an invitation. He presents this path of consecrated singleness and basically says, look, if this teaching is for you, if you've been given this particular gift, then embrace it. It's a deeply personal thing between an individual and God.
And that really leaves us with the final question to think about, doesn't it? Whether you're married or single, the core teaching here is about being completely dedicated to God's work. So the question isn't really which path is better. The real question is, on whatever path you're on, what does full devotion to God's kingdom require of you, right here, right now?